So, can you tell me about the theological background of Transcendentalism?
So I would say that it all starts with Calvinism. American religious history really goes back to Calvinism.
hmm
Should we assume that everybody knows what there is to know about Calvinism, or should we refresh their
I think
memories?
you should refresh just in case.
Just in case anybody's there who's like not up to speed?
Yeah.
Okay. So Calvinism is really based on kind of a system that emphasizes the majesty of God, just how transcendental God is, and also human depravity, the sinfulness of man and the inability of man to escape from his own sinfulness.
hmm
So that was really kind of the major emphases of Calvin. Um, it had a very limited view of human freedom.
hmm
By the time of the followers of Calvin, they actually came to believe really in predestination, that there was a certain group of people who were the elect of God, who God had chosen to be the saints, to be good, and they were, by grace, they were able to escape from their own innate sinfulness, but it wasn't had nothing to do with their own ability, that it was totally by grace. And they were neither free to reject, they weren't free to reject that grace, just like nobody else was free to be good without the help of God. So there really was very much emphasis on divine predestination.
hmm
Calvin also relied very much on the Bible, both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, and that became the paradigm for for his view of human behavior. So he had a very theocratic view of how human government should be organized, uh, based on the kingdoms, based on Moses, based on David, based on Solomon. Um, and this idea of chosenness very much carried over into New England. When the Puritans left, um, actually left from Holland, which was the center of Calvinism in Europe. They came to New England. They formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Boston, and things like that, based on Calvinist principles. And they viewed the world as one in which them, the chosen, had been saved by God from Europe and brought over the ocean. They viewed the formation of America sort of a recapitulation, if you will, of the Exodus story. Um, and that was how New England was perceived, and that's how New England was formed.
Very cool. How would you say Transcendentalism relates to Unitarianism?
So by the end of the 18th century, um, a lot of the Calvinist doctrines that had really shaped New England thought from its formation during the 16 and 1700s, the clergy started to reject them. Really, the only school of theology, the place where every minister in New England went to be trained, was Harvard. And by the year 1800 or shortly thereafter, almost all of the faculty of Harvard that taught divinity had become Unitarian.
Okay.
They rejected a lot of the doctrines of Calvinism, and what they were really trying to do was go back and develop a system of beliefs that they felt actually were more reflective of the New Testament. So there was a whole bunch of different people. It was shaped a lot by William Emery Channing, but they kind of coalesced around four basic principles. One, they believed in the fatherhood of God. Um, they believed they rejected the idea of Jesus being divine. So
hmm
the idea of the hypostatic union of Jesus as a being who was both fully human and fully divine, that was rejected by the Unitarians. In terms of human nature, um, they had a much more positive view of human nature than did Calvinism. They believed in that people had a potential for virtue, that people could become good based on the strength of their own spirit.
hmm
Um,
Could they redeem themselves?
they could, and it didn't require atonement,
Okay.
unlike the unlike the medieval doctrine of atonement that had dominated Christian theology for many centuries, where original sin was so grave a sin that no human could atone for it, that it required the self-sacrifice of a person who was both fully human and fully divine. Um, they rejected that,
Mm-hmm.
and they believed in it. They believed in the mission of Jesus as altering the human heart. So they
Okay.
believed that each person had within himself the ability to model himself and pattern himself after the example of Jesus and become virtuous. So those were the central premises of Unitarianism. So as we'll see, Transcendentalism consisted of a group of people, most of whom came from a Unitarian background, but that was kind of the trajectory of the thought of New England, where it was originally Calvinist, Calvinism was rejected by the Unitarians, and then Transcendentalists came along and rejected the Unitarian tradition.
Okay. So, which philosophical issues did Transcendentalism really address?
So I think really at the beginning of the Transcendentalist movement is an issue about epistemology, the question of how does man know?
Mm-hmm.
And much of the philosophical premises of the latter part of the 1700s were based on John Locke, who believed in a tabula rasa. Every person was sort of a blank slate, and that person would know through experience. Um, and we'll be covering epistemology more as we go through the semester, but just at this stage, I think it's important to know that this was really a key jumping off point for Transcendentalism, that they rejected the Lockean epistemology in favor of belief that a person could come to know through his own intuition. Um, they were heavily influenced by people who were influenced by Kant. And I think that they thought they were influenced by Kant, even though by now most people who really, now know Kant and examine the way they thought, they don't really think the Transcendentalists were accurately based on a Kantian epistemology. But from their perspective, they viewed Kant and, in general, the course of German epistemology as breaking from the English Lockean tradition based on experience and moving to one that was based on intuition.
Oh.
There is a very important philosopher by the name of Victor Cousin, a French philosopher, who by now is not particularly widely known, but for the Transcendentalists, Cousin's emphasis on intuitive understanding as a source of knowledge, that was really key to their understanding of epistemology.
Okay. What were the ideological issues that they faced?
So at the time, there was really a lot of ideological changes within American society, and one of the key ones that we'll be seeing coming up is abolitionism. Um, prior to 1831, there wasn't really an abolitionist movement. There was an anti-slavery movement. It was centered in Philadelphia, and it was really focused on individual action for individual persons who had been subject to slavery, who had escaped. So the typical anti-slavery movement before the 1830s involved, you would have an individual, he had escaped from slavery or his owner had brought him north or whatever, and there would be a controversy as how do we free this particular individual from slavery. In the 1830s, William Lloyd Garrison began an abolitionist movement in Massachusetts that was oriented towards abolishing the system of slavery. And Garrison had a very complex relationship with organized religion. He was not religious, and he viewed religion as upholding slave systems, and the relationship of the religious systems to Garrison is a complex topic. But that's really one of the major ideological questions that had come up, and that Transcendentalism would be faced with during the course of the Transcendentalist movement.
Okay. And what were the political and economic um, currents happening during the rise and the period of Transcendentalism?
Okay, so American history was really going through a lot of changes at that time. As we'll see, Transcendentalism really started in the late 1830s, but even before that time, the perception of America was going through just an enormous amount of changes. In 1832, Andrew Jackson was elected president, and Jacksonian democracy was very, very different from the more elitist democratic movements that had taken place, that had really been predominant since the American Revolution. Jacksonian democracy, which was much more populist. Um, and in New England was really the heartland of the Federalist Party, later
Mm-hmm.
the Whig Party, who rejected the idea of Jacksonian democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in 1836, after Jackson's second term, Martin Van Buren run,
Mm-hmm.
and the Whig Party was still in the process of bringing itself together. So there really was not an organized anti-Van Buren candidate. It was kind of interesting what the Whigs did. Um, Again, in those days, that all of the things that we take for granted now, that there'll be political parties, like the political party will nominate a candidate for president, that really hadn't been established yet.
Mm-hmm.
So what the Whig Party did in 1836 was that they identified four different people who each had a strong following in different parts of the country, and they ran all four with the thinking that if among them they had won enough electoral votes to deprive Van Buren of a majority in the electoral college, they would the election would go to the House of
Mm-hmm.
Representatives. So the Whig strategy was to deliberately try to send the election to the House of Representatives, where they had an advantage. So they ran William Henry Harrison, who was from Ohio, Daniel Webster, who was from Massachusetts. Um, they ran all these different candidates, deliberately trying to throw the election into the House.
Was it
So
successful?
it was not. Van Buren won
Yeah.
a majority in the Electoral College, and he became president. Um, but his presidency ran into some bumps. Um, and almost immediately after he took office, so he took office in early 1837, and almost immediately there was a financial crisis, and it was really kind of the first nationwide financial crisis that the United States had hit since the Revolution. And basically, what happened was um, is that there had been a lot of speculative investment in American assets,
Mm-hmm.
predominantly from British investors. And because of conditions in Britain, um, and because of changes in interest rates, there was like a popping of the bubble, and all of a sudden there was a huge collapse in values.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really the first time where people had experienced that. And one of the things that it taught people was that even though America had become this independent country, it was still part of a larger economic system
Mm-hmm.
where the rates of interest rates or commodity prices in England could impact the day-to-day life of Americans, and people could end up unemployed because of things that happened in England. So it really kind of changed the way Americans thought about the United States from an economic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But the changes had really been brewing for quite some time, and it really relates to another thing that at the time, an event that people thought was incredibly significant. Now it's kind of obscure, which was the completion of the Erie Canal.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1825, the Erie Canal was completed. The Erie Canal connects Buffalo to Albany.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, it allows somebody to go by water from Lake Erie across. Um, and what that did is by having easier access to the Midwest, it really opened up the Midwest to international trade, so that you could grow wheat in upstate New York or anywhere, Ohio, Illinois, anywhere along the coast of the Great Lakes. Um, Agricultural products, mineral products could be brought to the ports, like Buffalo, taken by barge across upstate New York to Albany, and then sailed down the Hudson. So, um, again, even though by now the Erie Canal has kind of lapsed into obscurity, it really was a major step in opening up the West, the American West, transforming New York really into a major port, really outshining the other eastern ports. Before the Erie Canal, New York was pretty much on par with Boston, Philadelphia, Charlotte, Charleston, some of the other
Mm-hmm.
ports on the East Coast. Once the Erie Canal came along, New York really became America's outlet to Europe. So um, the outcome of the Erie Canal led to this speculative investment that then popped in 1837, um, tanking Van Buren's presidency. And what that led to, so then Van Buren was elected president in 1836, and really the transformative election of the period before the Civil War was 1840.
Uh-huh.
In 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected as the Whig candidate. Van Buren, people had thought of him as kind of a failure because of the Panic of 1837, even
Mm-hmm.
though it wasn't his fault. It happened just like literally weeks after he took office. But he wasn't perceived as having dealt with it very well. So in 1840, um, William Henry Harrison became president. And I think one of the reasons that uh, his election was so significant is that he was the first presidential candidate in American history who was really perceived as the candidate of the religious um, segment of society. Um, Nowadays, we kind of take it for granted that sort of like there's a Christian right who will support a certain candidate,
Mm-hmm.
and William Henry Harrison was the first candidate who had that. Van Buren was perceived as being very he was from New York. He was perceived as being very commercial, very pro New York. At the time, New York uh, was experiencing a big influx of Catholic immigrants. So Van Buren was perceived as being sort of pro Catholic. And Harrison was perceived as being this American hero who would stand up for America, for Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
What happened is he was elected fairly in a pretty much a landslide. Um, but he went to his inauguration. It happened to be a cold, rainy day. He got a cold,
Didn't wear a coat.
didn't wear a coat, and he died. And just from a theological perspective, the idea that this person who was supposed to be kind of the representative of Christianity in America died like literally a month after taking office made a lot of the religious communities who had supported his candidacy really question what has God done.
Mm.
Um, and he was succeeded after that by John Tyler, who was his running mate, but he led to kind of a series of um, fairly weak people, weak presidents, people who either only lasted one term in office or who died in office. Later there went Tyler, then James Knox Polk, then Zachary Taylor, who also died in office, was succeeded by Millard Fillmore, um, who didn't run for re-election, followed by Franklin Pierce. So this whole period between 1836 and the Civil War was kind of characterized by a whole bunch of presidents who were um, one-term people who were perceived as fairly weak. The other major event of this period was the annexation of Texas. This is moving on a little bit forward, but then moving into the late 1840s, there were two events that we're going to see had a major impact on Transcendentalism. The first was the annexation of Texas, when Texas seceded from Mexico and joined the Union. Um, and the other was the Mexican War, when America, as part of the outcome of that whole Texas issue, American troops invaded Mexico, occupied Mexico City, and then forced a treaty in which Mexico ceded a large portion of its territory, establishing the Rio Grande as the border between the United States and Mexico, and ceding to America what would later become, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah. So by the end of that period, um, kind of the idea of what America was had really changed. If you look at the period of like when Jackson was president, the bulk of America was really along the Atlantic coast. There was starting to be immigration towards the Mississippi. And because of the Louisiana Purchase, America did have sovereignty over a large chunk of the Pacific Northwest, but it really hadn't been integrated into America or really the American consciousness. And with the Great Expansion west, with the building of the Erie Canal, then the Mexican War, America as a distinct entity started to take shape. And a lot of the issues that we're going to be covering during the semester revolve around the question of how do we think about America? How do we think about American culture? What is it? What does it mean to be an American? How does the political system work? What's the meaning of the political system? And all of this relates to some of those theological and philosophical questions that we started out with.
With the American identity.
American identity.
Sounds cool. Are you going to have any guest lecturers?
Actually, we are.
Who?
So after we take a break, we're going to have Lin-Manuel Miranda come visit us.
No way.
Yeah, he's going to be talking to us about his new project. Nobody's heard about it yet.
Wow.
Yeah, he's making a new musical. It's going on Broadway. It's about the election of 1840. Yeah.
I love that.
It's called Harrison. And you know who it's about?
William Henry Harrison.
William Henry Harrison. So my students are going to be the first to hear about it.
Wow.
Oh.
Cool.
We've been going for a while. You know what I think we should have now?
A snack.
A snack.
I'm hungry.
Okay. All the students go get yourself a snack.